She thought the yellowed paper in her mother's attic was just another forgotten bill. But that single deed led Margaret and Frank Carter, 72 and 75 years old, to a locked mountain fortress hiding $265 million and a secret that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about the woman who raised them. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the small ranch house on Maple Street, casting soft shadows across the worn carpet. Margaret Carter sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at a stack of medical bills that seemed to grow taller every week. At 72, she'd imagined retirement differently. She'd pictured road trips with Frank, her husband of 51 years, maybe some volunteer work at the library where she'd spent 37 years stamping books and recommending stories to wide-eyed children. Instead, she was measuring out pills, calculating co-pays, and wondering if they'd have to sell the house. Frank shuffled into the kitchen, his 75-year-old frame still strong but slower now, carrying the weight of decades as a postal worker. His route had been the same for 42 years. Every house, every mailbox, every dog that barked at his truck. He'd retired with a modest pension, and they'd been fine. Not wealthy, never wealthy, but fine. Then came the heart surgery last year, then Margaret's hip replacement, then the medications that insurance only partially covered, and suddenly fine became fragile. "Morning, Maggie," he said softly, kissing the top of her silver hair. She looked up, forcing a smile. "Morning, love." He glanced at the bills. "That bad?" "Worse," she admitted. "I called the hospital again. They said they could put us on a payment plan, but Frank, we're already on 3 payment plans." He sat down heavily across from her, his weathered hands folding over hers. They'd built a life together in this small Colorado town, raised 2 children here, buried Margaret's parents here. This house held 50 years of memories, but memories didn't pay for prescriptions. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his voice carried doubt. "We always do." Margaret nodded, but her eyes drifted to the window, to the mountains in the distance that had always made her feel small and safe at the same time. She thought about her mother, Eleanor, who'd passed away 6 months ago at 94. Eleanor had lived her entire life in that same modest way, working at the town library, clipping coupons, mending clothes instead of buying new ones. She'd left Margaret the house she'd grown up in, already sold now to help with expenses, and boxes upon boxes of belongings that still sat untouched in their attic. "I should go through Mama's things," Margaret said suddenly. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Now?" "I've been putting it off for half a year, and honestly, I need something to do besides stare at bills I can't pay." The attic smelled like dust and time, that particular scent of cardboard boxes and old fabric that exists nowhere else in the world. Margaret climbed the creaky pull-down ladder slowly, Frank steadying it from below despite his own aching knees. The space was cramped, insulation showing between exposed beams, and hot despite the cool October morning outside. Boxes were stacked in neat rows, labeled in Eleanor's careful handwriting. Christmas decorations 1985, Margaret's school papers, photographs 1962 to 1975. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Her mother had been nothing if not organized, a librarian to her core. She started with the nearest box, finding old quilts and linens, the kind Eleanor had insisted on keeping even though they were threadbare. The next box held books, first editions of classics Eleanor had collected over decades. Margaret set them aside gently. Maybe they could sell some. It felt wrong, but so did losing their home. 3 boxes in, she found something different. A brown leather portfolio, cracked with age, tucked beneath a stack of manila folders. It looked official, important, completely unlike the sentimental collection surrounding it. Margaret pulled it out carefully, wiping dust from the surface. The portfolio was secured with a small brass clasp, tarnished green with time. She opened it slowly, and inside found a collection of documents. The first was a deed, the paper thick and formal, printed on legal stock that had yellowed but remained intact. She read the header, squinting in the dim attic light. Property deed and title, parcel number 4728, Summit County, Colorado, dated March 15, 1973. Margaret's heart skipped. 1973. She'd been 21 then, newly married to Frank, pregnant with their first child. Her mother had been working at the library, living in the same small house she'd occupied since Margaret's father died in 1968. There'd been no mention of property, no discussion of real estate or investments. She read further, her eyes catching on the names listed as co-owners: Eleanor Rose Morrison and Edward James Whitmore. Margaret froze. She knew her mother's name, obviously, but Edward James Whitmore meant nothing to her. She'd never heard that name, not once in 72 years of life, not in all the stories her mother had told about working at the library, about her quiet life, about anything. The property description was sparse but specific. 17 acres, unincorporated Summit County, Colorado, mountain residential parcel, access via County Road 412, approximately 8 miles northwest of Silver Ridge Township. She turned the page and found more documents, a survey map showing the property boundaries, a small, faded photograph of what looked like a massive lodge built into a mountainside, stone and timber construction, multiple stories surrounded by pine trees, and a handwritten note on library stationery in her mother's distinctive script. For Margaret, if you ever find this, know that I made my choice with open eyes and a clear heart. What we built mattered more than what we owned, but this belongs to you now, Mama. Margaret's hands trembled. She read the note 3 times, trying to understand. What choice? What did they build? And who was Edward Whitmore? "Frank!" she called down through the attic opening, her voice cracking. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, then his concerned face appearing at the ladder's base. "What's wrong? You okay?" "Come up here. You need to see this." He climbed up with difficulty, joints protesting, and found her sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor, papers spread around her like evidence at a crime scene. She handed him the deed without a word. Frank adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the document. His eyebrows rose slowly. "This says your mother owned property, 17 acres in the mountains." "Co-owned," Margaret corrected, "with someone named Edward Whitmore." "Never heard of him." "Neither have I. Mama never mentioned him. Not once." Frank picked up the photograph of the lodge. "This is a serious piece of property, Maggie. This isn't some hunting cabin. This is a estate." "Dated 1973, Margaret repeated. "I was pregnant with David. We were living in that tiny apartment above the hardware store. If Mama owned half of something like this, why were we struggling? Why did she work at the library until she was 87 years old? Why did she clip coupons and wear the same coat for 20 years? Frank had no answer. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the house settling and the distant rumble of a neighbor's lawnmower. "There's an address," Frank finally said, pointing to the deed. "County Road 412, Silver Ridge Township. That's what, 3 hours from here." "About that," Margaret agreed. "You want to go look?" She stared at him. "Frank, we don't even know if it's still standing. This deed is 52 years old. The place could be rubble. It could be owned by someone else now. It could be anything." "Or," Frank said slowly, "it could be something that helps us." The weight of those words settled between them. The bills downstairs, the second mortgage they'd taken, the phone calls they'd been avoiding. Margaret looked at the photograph again, at the grand lodge perched on the mountainside, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope, maybe, or just desperate curiosity. "Our kids will think we're crazy," she said. Frank smiled. "They already think we're old and stubborn. Might as well add crazy to the list." they told their son David that evening over the phone. He lived in Denver with his wife and 2 teenagers, busy with a career in software sales that Margaret only partially understood. "Mom, that sounds like a scam," David said flatly. "People don't just find deeds to mountain estates in their dead grandmother's attic." "It's real, David. I have the original deed right here." "Okay, but even if it's real, that doesn't mean you own it. 52 years is a long time. There could be back taxes, liens, squatters, anything. You should take it to a lawyer." "We're going to drive up there first," Margaret said, "just to see." "Mom, David, we're going. Your father and I have made up our minds." There was a long silence. "You're really doing this?" "We really are." Another pause. "Call me when you get there. And Mom, be careful. I don't like the idea of you two driving into the mountains chasing some mystery property." "We'll be fine, honey. We're old, not helpless." They left early the next morning, Frank's old truck rumbling to life with the kind of stubborn persistence they'd both come to embody. Margaret packed sandwiches, a thermos of coffee, and the leather portfolio with all its mysterious documents. The morning was crisp, autumn painting the lower elevations in gold and rust. The drive took them west, away from their small town and into progressively more rural country. They passed through places that barely qualified as towns, just clusters of buildings around gas stations and post offices. Frank drove carefully, hands at 10 and 2 like he'd done for 51 years, while Margaret navigated using both the deed's description and her phone's GPS. "County Road 412 should be coming up in about 6 miles, she said, squinting at the map. The landscape had changed dramatically. They were climbing now, the road twisting through dense pine forests, occasional breaks revealing stunning valley views. The air felt thinner, cleaner. They passed a sign that read Silver Ridge Township, population 347, elevation 8,200 feet. "This is beautiful country," Frank murmured. "Mama never mentioned coming up here," Margaret said. "Not once. I remember every vacation we took, camping at the lake, that one trip to California to see the ocean, never the mountains like this." Maybe she didn't come up here. Maybe she just owned it. But why? And with this Edward Whitmore person, who was he to her? 5 miles past Silver Ridge, they found County Road 412. It wasn't paved, just maintained gravel, and a wooden sign pointed into the forest. The truck bounced over ruts as they climbed higher, trees pressing close on both sides. Margaret gripped the door handle, not from fear, but from anticipation. They drove for 20 minutes, seeing nothing but wilderness. Then Frank slowed. "Look at that," he said, pointing. Ahead, the trees opened into a clearing, and they saw it. A fence. Not a rustic split-rail fence like you'd expect in the mountains, but a serious 8-foot chain-link barrier topped with barbed wire. It stretched in both directions, disappearing into the forest. And mounted on posts every 50 feet were signs. "No trespassing. Private property. Violators will be prosecuted." "Jesus," Margaret whispered. Frank drove slowly along the fence line until they reached a gate. It was heavy steel, secured with a thick chain and industrial padlock. Beside the gate stood a small guardhouse, and mounted above it was a camera, the red light blinking to indicate it was active. "This place is guarded," Frank said, stating the obvious. "For 52 years?" Margaret's voice rose. "Frank, this doesn't make sense. Abandoned property doesn't have security cameras." They sat in the truck, engine idling, staring at the locked gate. Beyond it, they could see a gravel road continuing up the mountain, but the trees were too thick to see any buildings. "What do we do?" Frank asked. Before Margaret could answer, a vehicle approached from inside the property. A green pickup truck, old but well-maintained, driven by a man who looked to be in his 60s. He had a weathered face, grey beard, and wore a canvas jacket and work boots. He pulled up to the gate on the other side and got out, studying them with cautious eyes. Frank rolled down his window. "Hello there." The man nodded but didn't speak. He walked to the gate, staying on his side of the chain link. "Can I help you?" His voice was gruff but not unfriendly. Margaret leaned across Frank. "My name is Margaret Carter. I believe I might have ownership interest in this property." The man's expression didn't change. "This is private property. Has been for 52 years. "I know," Margaret said quickly. "My mother, Eleanor Morrison, she's listed on the deed as co-owner. She passed away 6 months ago, and I just found the documents." Something flickered in the man's eyes. "Eleanor Morrison. Yes, did you know her?" He shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, but I know the name. Mr. Whitmore left very specific instructions concerning Eleanor Morrison and her heirs." Margaret's heart hammered. "Mr. Whitmore? Edward Whitmore?" "That's right. Is he here? Can we speak with him?" The man's face softened slightly. "Mr. Whitmore passed away 21 years ago, ma'am, in 2004. Margaret felt something deflate in her chest. Another dead end, another person who might have explained this mystery, gone. "I'm the caretaker here," the man continued. "Name's Tom Griffin. Been working this property since 1998. "Caretaker?" Frank echoed. "You mean someone's been maintaining this place all this time?" "That's exactly what I mean. Mr. Whitmore set up a trust before he died. Pays for upkeep, security, property taxes, everything. All with very specific instructions about who could access the property." Margaret fumbled with the portfolio, pulling out the deed with shaking hands. "I have the original deed here, and a note from my mother." Tom looked at the documents through the fence, then pulled out his phone. "I need to make a call. This is above my pay grade." "To who?" Frank asked. "The estate attorney. He handles all matters related to the property and the trust. If what you're saying is true, if you're really Eleanor Morrison's daughter, then there are protocols to follow." He walked away from the gate, phone to his ear, his voice too low to hear. Margaret and Frank waited, hands intertwined across the truck's bench seat. "This is real," Margaret whispered. "Frank, this is actually real." "Don't get ahead of yourself," he cautioned, though his eyes were bright with the same hope. "We don't know what this means yet." Tom returned 5 minutes later. "Attorney's coming up from Denver. Should be here in about 2 hours. He says you're to wait and you're not to leave." "We're not going anywhere," Margaret assured him. Tom nodded, then surprised them by unlocking the gate and swinging it open. "You can pull inside and park by the guardhouse. No sense making you sit out on the road." They drove through slowly, and Tom closed the gate behind them. Up close, they could see the guardhouse was actually quite nice, insulated, with a small heater and a coffee maker visible through the window. "Been doing this job 26 years, Tom said, leaning against their truck. "Never thought I'd see this day." "What day?" Margaret asked. "The day Eleanor Morrison's family came looking." Margaret got out of the truck, legs stiff from the drive. "You knew she existed?" "I knew the name, knew she was listed on the deed, knew Mr. Whitmore had left instructions about her or her heirs showing up. But 52 years is a long time, ma'am. Most folks figured it would never happen." "Most folks?" Frank asked, joining Margaret outside. "Who else knows about this place?" Tom gestured vaguely toward the forest. "The trust, the attorney, handful of people in Silver Ridge who've worked for the property over the years, but it's kept quiet. Mr. Whitmore wanted it that way." "What's up there?" Margaret pointed up the road toward where it disappeared into the trees. Tom followed her gaze. "The house, 17 acres total, but the main structure sits on about 3 of them. Rest is forest and natural landscape." "And you maintain it? All of it?" "Me and a couple others. Landscaping crew comes once a month. I do the general upkeep, check the systems, keep everything secure. It's been my job since Mr. Whitmore hired me." "But he died in 2004, Frank said. "You've been doing this for 21 years with no one living there?" That's right. Trust pays my salary, provides a house in Silver Ridge for me and my wife. I come up here 3 times a week, more if there's weather or issues. The house is fully maintained, utilities on, everything kept exactly as Mr. Whitmore specified. Margaret felt dizzy. Why? Why would someone do that? Tom looked at her with something like sympathy. That's a question for the attorney, ma'am. All I know is Mr. Whitmore was very clear. The property was to be maintained indefinitely, kept secure, and only Eleanor Morrison or her direct descendants were permitted access. He was waiting for someone, and I guess that someone is you. They waited in the truck while Tom returned to the guardhouse. Margaret couldn't sit still. She kept looking up the road, trying to imagine what lay beyond the trees. A house that had been maintained but empty for 21 years. A property her mother had co-owned but never mentioned. A man named Edward Whitmore, who died 2 decades ago but left instructions spanning half a century. What did Mama do? Margaret wondered aloud. What was she involved in that she never told me? Frank squeezed her hand. Maybe she had her reasons. Or maybe she was ashamed, or scared, or... Margaret's voice broke. I thought I knew her, Frank. I thought I knew everything about her life. You knew her, Frank said firmly. Whatever this is, it doesn't change that. Eleanor was a good woman, a good mother, a good person. This is just a part of her story you didn't know yet. They sat in silence for a while. The forest was quiet, except for wind in the pines and the occasional call of a bird. Margaret watched the camera above the guardhouse slowly pan left and right, its red light blinking steadily. $265 million, she said suddenly. Frank turned to her. What? That's what Tom said, isn't it? In the trust, maintaining a property like this, paying a caretaker for decades, keeping utilities on. Frank, that takes serious money. We don't know what's in the trust, but we know it's been running for 52 years. We know it's maintained a full estate with security and staff. We know Edward Whitmore was wealthy enough to set all that up and have it continue for 2 decades after his death. Margaret's hands shook. What if this is real? What if there's actual value here? Frank wanted to tell her not to hope, not to expect anything, but he couldn't, because he was thinking the same thing. Thinking about the medical bills, the mortgage payments, the prescriptions they sometimes skipped to make the money stretch further. Thinking about what it would mean to not be afraid anymore. An hour and 47 minutes later, a black sedan came up the mountain road, moving fast enough to kick up gravel, but controlled enough to show the driver knew these roads. It pulled up to the gate, and Tom let it through. The sedan parked beside their truck, and a man in his 50s stepped out, wearing a dark suit that seemed out of place in the mountain wilderness. He was tall, thin, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with the kind of precise confidence that came from years of handling important matters. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Richard Moss, attorney for the Whitmore estate." Margaret shook his hand, noticing how smooth his palm was compared to her own work-worn fingers. "Yes, I'm Margaret. This is my husband, Frank." Richard shook Frank's hand as well, then turned to Tom. "Thank you for calling me immediately." "Yes, sir." Richard turned back to Margaret. "I understand you have documents pertaining to this property?" She handed him the leather portfolio. He opened it carefully, examining each document with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading legal papers. His expression remained neutral until he reached Eleanor's handwritten note. There, something softened. "This is your mother's handwriting?" "Yes, I'd recognize it anywhere. She was a librarian, very precise with her penmanship." Richard looked up at her, and his face had changed. The professional distance had cracked, revealing something almost like relief. "Mrs. Carter, I've been the estate attorney for the Whitmore Trust since 2001. I took over from my father, who handled the estate from its inception in 1973. For my entire legal career, I've been waiting for this moment." Margaret's voice came out barely above a whisper. "What moment?" "The moment Eleanor Morrison or her heirs came looking." He closed the portfolio carefully. "Mrs. Carter, do you have identification with you? Something that proves your relationship to Eleanor Morrison?" She fumbled for her purse, pulling out her driver's license and, on impulse, an old photograph she always carried. Her mother, at age 60, standing in front of the library, smiling that quiet smile Margaret had known her whole life. Richard examined both, then pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Yes, it's verified. Eleanor Morrison's daughter, Margaret Carter, is here with documentation. We need to proceed with the protocols." He listened for a moment, then added, "Understood. I'll handle it personally." He ended the call and looked at Margaret and Frank with an expression that was hard to read. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to believe. But I need you to understand that every word is true, every document is authentic, and everything has been verified through multiple legal channels over 5 decades. Frank stepped closer to Margaret. "We're listening." Edward Whitmore was a technological innovator in the early 1970s. He held patents related to early computer systems, microprocessors, and data storage that became fundamental to the digital revolution. At the time, his work was considered advanced but not revolutionary. But as technology evolved, those patents became incredibly valuable. Richard paused, letting that sink in. "Your mother, Eleanor Morrison, was Edward Whitmore's business partner and co-developer of several key technologies. They worked together from 1969 to 1973, developing innovations that would change the world." Margaret shook her head. "That's not possible. My mother was a librarian. She worked at the town library for her entire career." "She was a librarian," Richard agreed. "But before that, and during the early part of her career there, she was also a brilliant mind in emerging computer science. She and Edward met at a technology conference in Denver in 1968. They collaborated on projects that were years ahead of their time." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside were photographs. Margaret gasped. There was her mother, young, maybe 40 years old, standing beside a tall man with dark hair and intense eyes. They were in what looked like a laboratory, surrounded by primitive computers and technical equipment. In another photo, they were both smiling, holding up a circuit board like a trophy. "That's Mama," Margaret breathed, "but I've never seen these pictures." Edward Whitmore kept extensive documentation of their work together, Richard continued. In 1973, they completed their most significant project, a data compression algorithm that would eventually become standard in digital storage. At that point, they faced a choice. A military contractor offered them $37 million for exclusive rights to the technology. $37 million, Frank repeated. In 1973? Equivalent to over $200 million today, Richard confirmed. Edward wanted to take it. He saw the financial security, the recognition, the chance to build an empire. But Eleanor refused. She'd researched the contractor and discovered the technology would be used primarily for weapon systems and surveillance. She felt it violated the ethical principles that had guided their work. Margaret's throat tightened. That sounded exactly like her mother. Eleanor had always had a quiet, moral compass, unwavering and absolute. They argued for weeks, Richard continued. Eventually, Eleanor made her decision. She walked away from the project, from the money, from everything they'd built together. But Edward couldn't let her leave with nothing. He'd already purchased this property as a retreat where they could work undisturbed. He put her name on the deed as co-owner, equal share. Then he sold the technology without her. "And became rich," Margaret said quietly. "Extraordinarily so. The patents he held, developed with your mother's help, eventually generated billions. But Edward never stopped feeling guilty. According to his journals, which are part of the estate, he tried for years to contact Eleanor, to apologize, to offer her share of the wealth. She refused all contact. Margaret could picture it. Her mother, stubborn and principled, refusing to profit from something she believed was wrong. Even if it meant struggling, even if it meant working until she was 87 years old, even if it meant never telling her daughter about any of it. When Edward died in 2004, Richard said, he left very specific instructions in his will. This property and a substantial trust fund were to be maintained indefinitely for Eleanor Morrison or her direct heirs. The house was to be kept exactly as they'd left it in 1973, preserved as a memorial to their partnership and to the principles she'd stood for. "How much?" Frank asked, his voice rough. "How much is in the trust?" Richard met his eyes. "The current value of the trust, the property and associated assets is approximately $265 million. The forest went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Margaret felt Frank's hand grip hers so tight it hurt. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she'd just heard. $265 million, she repeated numbly. "Yes, ma'am. And according to Edward Whitmore's will, if Eleanor Morrison was deceased, which we've now confirmed, the entire estate passes to her direct descendants." Richard looked at Margaret with something close to wonder. "Mrs. Carter, you're the sole heir. This all belongs to you." Margaret's knees gave out. Frank caught her, held her up, his own legs shaking. Tom had emerged from the guardhouse and stood at a respectful distance, witness to a moment 52 years in the making. "I don't understand," Margaret whispered. "Why didn't he find me? Why wait until I found this place?" Richard's expression softened. "Because Edward Whitmore respected your mother's choice. She walked away on principle, and he honored that, even after death. The will specifies that no one from the estate was to contact Eleanor or her family. You had to come here of your own accord, just as your mother chose to walk away of her own accord. He wanted you to have the choice she never got, to accept or refuse on your own terms." Margaret looked up the road toward the house she couldn't yet see. Somewhere up there was a life her mother had lived in secret, work she'd done that changed the world, and choices she'd made that defined who she was. And now, impossibly, it all belonged to Margaret. "Can we see it?" she asked, her voice small. "Can we see the house?" Richard smiled gently. "Mrs. Carter, it's your house. You can do whatever you want." They followed Richard's sedan up the winding private road, Tom leading the convoy in his green pickup. The trees pressed close on both sides, tall pines that filtered the afternoon sunlight into golden shafts. The road climbed steadily, switchbacking twice before opening into a clearing that took Margaret's breath away. The lodge stood before them like something from another time, massive and magnificent. It was built into the mountainside itself, 3 stories of stone and timber that seemed to grow organically from the rock. The foundation was natural stone, fitted so precisely it looked like the work of ancient masons. Above that, huge timber beams formed the frame, weathered to a rich grey but solid as the day they'd been raised. The roof was steep, designed to shed heavy mountain snow, covered in dark shingles that blended with the forest canopy. Floor-to-ceiling windows dominated the front facade, reflecting the pine trees and sky. A wide deck wrapped around the visible side of the structure, supported by massive log columns. Everything about it spoke of craftsmanship, permanence, and serious money. Frank let out a low whistle. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph." Margaret couldn't speak. She just stared, trying to reconcile this grand estate with the mother she'd known, the woman who'd darned socks and made soup from leftover bones. Richard parked and stepped out, briefcase in hand. "The house was built in 1971. Edward and your mother designed it together as a retreat where they could work without interruption. The lower level contains the original laboratory. The main floor has living spaces, kitchen, library. The upper floor has bedrooms and private studies." "And it's been empty since 2004? Frank asked. "Occupied only by maintenance staff," Richard corrected. "Tom and his team have kept everything in working order. Utilities are active, systems maintained. It's completely functional, just waiting. They approached the front entrance, a massive double door made of oak and iron. Richard produced a key ring from his briefcase, but before he could unlock it, he paused and turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Carter, before we go inside, I need you to understand something. This house is a time capsule. Edward's instructions were explicit. Nothing was to be changed, moved, or altered. What you're about to see is exactly how your mother and Edward left it in 1973, the day she walked away." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Richard unlocked the door. It swung open smoothly, well-oiled hinges silent. Warm air drifted out, carrying scents of wood polish and something faintly floral. They stepped inside. The entry hall was grand, but not ostentatious. The floor was polished hardwood, covered partially by a thick woven rug in earth tones. The walls were wood paneling, dark and rich, decorated with abstract art pieces in the style of the early 70s. A staircase curved upward to the left, its banister carved from a single massive piece of timber. But what stopped Margaret in her tracks was the light. The entire back wall of the house was glass, floor to ceiling, opening onto a view of the valley below. Mountains rolled away in every direction, layer upon layer of peaks fading to blue in the distance. The sun hung low now, painting everything in amber and gold. "Mama stood here," Margaret whispered. She looked at this view. They moved deeper into the house. The main living area was sunken, 3 steps down from the entry, with built-in seating around a central stone fireplace that rose 2 stories. The furniture was pure 1970s, clean lines, earth tones, geometric patterns. A low coffee table held carefully arranged books, their spines showing titles about computer science, mathematics, philosophy. Everything was clean. Not a speck of dust, not a cobweb, not a sign of decay. It was as if the occupants had simply stepped out for a walk and might return at any moment. Frank ran his hand along the back of a chair, fingers trembling. "This is impossible. Houses don't stay like this for 50 years. "This one did," Tom said from the doorway. "Mr. Whitmore's trust pays for climate control, regular cleaning, pest management, everything. I've got a checklist I follow every visit. Keep it exactly as it was." Richard led them through the main floor. The kitchen was a marvel of 70s design, avocado green appliances, butcher block counters, copper pots hanging from a rack above an island. The refrigerator hummed softly, empty but running. In the pantry, Margaret found neat rows of canned goods, all from the 1970s, labels faded but intact. "Are these the original groceries?" she asked, incredulous. "Preserved as part of the house," Richard confirmed. "Edward wanted everything authentic." They moved to the library next, and Margaret gasped. One entire wall was floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with hundreds of volumes. She approached slowly, reading the spines. Technical manuals, computer programming texts from the early days of the field, mathematics, physics, but also poetry, philosophy, novels. Her fingers stopped on a familiar spine. "The complete works of Emily Dickinson," she breathed. "Mama loved Emily Dickinson. She used to read her poems to me when I was little." She pulled the book from the shelf carefully. It fell open to a page marked with a dried flower pressed between the pages. Someone had underlined a verse in pencil. "Hope is the thing with feathers, that perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. That was her mother's handwriting in the margin, the same precise script she'd seen on the note in the attic. "She was here," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "She really was here." Frank put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together in the silent library, surrounded by books and memories and questions that had no easy answers. Richard gave them time, then gently guided them to the far end of the main floor. They passed through a hallway lined with photographs, and Margaret stopped at each one, studying them with hungry eyes. There was her mother, young and vibrant, maybe 39 or 40 years old. She wore bell-bottom jeans and a turtleneck, her hair longer than Margaret had ever seen it, pulled back in a loose braid. She was laughing in one photo, her head thrown back, joy radiating from her face. Margaret had never seen her mother look so free. And in every photo, there was Edward. Tall, lean, with dark, intense eyes and a serious mouth that occasionally cracked into a smile. In some pictures, he and Eleanor stood beside complex equipment, pointing at screens and circuits. In others, they sat on the deck outside, notebooks open, clearly deep in discussion. In one, they stood together in front of the house, both covered in sawdust, both grinning like children who'd built the world's best fort. "They look happy," Frank observed quietly. "They were partners," Richard said, "not romantic, according to Edward's journals. Eleanor had been widowed and Edward never married, but they were intellectual equals, creative collaborators. Edward wrote that working with Eleanor was like finding the other half of his mind." Margaret touched the glass of one photograph, her fingers hovering over her mother's face. "Why didn't she ever tell me? Why keep all of this secret?" "Perhaps she wanted to protect you," Richard suggested. "Or perhaps the pain of walking away was too great to revisit." They continued down the hallway to a closed door at the end. Richard stopped, his hand on the doorknob. "This is Edward's private study. It's been locked since the day Eleanor left. Edward's instructions were that it should only be opened when Eleanor or her heir came to claim the property." He produced a different key, smaller and more ornate than the others. It looked old, like something that might open a jewelry box or a diary. He inserted it into the lock and turned. The mechanism clicked, loud in the quiet house. The door swung open. The study was smaller than the other rooms, but no less impressive. One wall was entirely glass, offering the same stunning mountain view. The other walls were covered in pegboards and whiteboards, filled with diagrams, equations, technical drawings. A large desk dominated the center of the room, made of dark wood with neat drawers and cubbyholes. On top of the desk sat an early computer terminal, boxy and primitive by modern standards, but clearly state-of-the-art for 1973. But what drew Margaret's attention was the wall behind the desk. It was covered in patent documents, each one framed and mounted with museum-quality care. She stepped closer, reading the titles. Data Compression Algorithm for Digital Storage Systems. Error Correction Protocol for Microprocessor Operations. Parallel Processing Architecture for Computational Efficiency. Each patent listed two names as inventors, Edward James Whitmore and Eleanor Rose Morrison. "Mama invented these," Margaret whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "She helped create all of this." "She was the primary developer on several of them," Richard said. "Edward handled the business side, the patents, the licensing, but the core innovations came from their collaboration, often from your mother's insights specifically." Frank was examining the whiteboards, though the technical notations meant little to him. "This is like looking at another language." "It essentially is," Richard agreed. Early computer science was pioneering work. They were inventing the vocabulary as they went along. Margaret moved to the desk. Its surface was neat, organized. A desk calendar sat open to March 1973, dates circled in red. A coffee mug held pens and pencils, all carefully sharpened. And in the center of the desk, placed with obvious intention, was an envelope. It was made of heavy cream-colored paper, and written across the front in bold black ink were the words, "To Eleanor or her descendants." Margaret's hands shook as she picked it up. The envelope wasn't sealed, just tucked closed. She looked at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. "It's meant for you." She opened it carefully and pulled out several pages of handwritten text. The handwriting was masculine, clear, written with the kind of careful precision that suggested the author had composed and recomposed every sentence in his mind before committing it to paper. "Dear Eleanor," it began. Margaret's voice caught, and Frank gently took the letter from her hands. "Let me read it," he offered. She nodded gratefully. Frank cleared his throat and began, "Dear Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I've passed on, and you or your children have finally come to claim what was always rightfully yours. I've waited years for this moment, hoped for it, though I knew you might never return. Your principles were too strong, your conviction too deep. I need you to know that walking away from the military contract was the right choice. It took me years to understand that, years of success and wealth and emptiness to realize what you knew immediately. The technology we created together should serve humanity, not destroy it. You saw that clearly. I was blinded by ambition. I sold the patents anyway, Eleanor, and I've regretted it every day since. Not because of the money, though there was more than either of us imagined. I regretted it because it broke our partnership, our trust, our shared vision of what technology could be if guided by ethics and compassion. I became wealthy beyond measure. The algorithms we developed together became fundamental to the digital revolution. Every computer, every phone, every digital device relies on principles we established in this house, in that laboratory downstairs where we worked side by side, believing we could change the world. We did change it, Eleanor, but not the way you wanted, not with the safeguards you insisted on, not with the ethical framework you tried to build. I licensed our work to anyone who would pay, and yes, much of it went to military applications, surveillance systems, exactly what you feared. I tried to make amends. I donated millions to humanitarian causes, established scholarship funds, supported research into ethical technology. But money can't erase choices, and philanthropy can't substitute for integrity. You taught me that, though I learned it too late. When I learned of your death, I admit I wept. I'd held on to hope that someday you might forgive me, that we might reconcile, at least speak once more. But you'd made your position clear. Every letter I sent was returned unopened. Every attempt at contact was rebuffed. You'd made your choice, and you honored it until the end. So I made my own choice. This house, our sanctuary, would be preserved exactly as we left it. The property we bought together would remain in your name, and the fortune built on our shared work, if you or your heirs ever came to claim it, would be yours without condition. I know this seems like hollow gesture. Giving away money after death costs nothing. But understand, Eleanor, I could have written you out completely. I could have claimed sole credit for our work, and no one would have questioned it. The patents are in both our names, but I was the one who pursued them, licensed them, built the empire. Legally, morally, I owed you nothing. But I owed you everything. Every algorithm, every innovation, every breakthrough came from our collaboration. You were the genius, Eleanor. I was just the businessman smart enough to recognize genius when I saw it. The trust I've established contains my entire estate. Approximately $265 million in current valuation, though by the time you read this, it may be more. It's managed conservatively, designed to grow modestly and sustain itself indefinitely. If you're reading this, then you've found your way back to our mountain sanctuary. I hope it brings you peace. I hope you can walk these rooms and remember the good times, the late nights solving impossible problems, the mornings when we'd realize we'd worked straight through without sleep, too excited by what we were discovering to rest. I hope you can forgive me, Eleanor, and if you can't, I understand. Some betrayals are too deep for forgiveness. But know this, everything we built, everything we discovered, everything that came from our partnership, it belongs to you. It always did. I was just the caretaker, the guardian, waiting for you to come home. With enduring respect and eternal regret, Edward James Whitmore. Written January 3rd, 2004. Frank's voice had grown rough toward the end. He folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Margaret, who held it like something sacred. The room was silent except for the soft tick of a clock on the wall and the distant sound of wind in the pines. 2004, Margaret said finally. He wrote this 3 months before he died. Richard nodded. His health was failing. He knew he didn't have much time. This letter was his final communication, his last attempt to reach her. But she was already gone, Margaret said. Mama died in 2003, a year before Edward. Yes, Richard confirmed gently. I don't think he knew. He'd stopped trying to contact her directly years before. He wouldn't have heard about her passing unless someone told him, and clearly no one did. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. They both died thinking the other hated them. Frank pulled her close, and she sobbed against his shoulder, while Richard and Tom stood respectfully silent. The weight of it was crushing, 50 years of separation, of pride and principle and pain, ending with two people dying alone, estranged, never knowing that forgiveness might have been possible. What happens next will unlock a secret that changes everything Margaret thought she knew about her mother, reveal a fortune that defies imagination, and prove that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, but understanding. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. When Margaret could finally breathe again, when the worst of the grief had passed, she wiped her eyes and looked around the study with new awareness. This wasn't just a room. It was a memorial, a shrine to partnership and loss. There's more, Richard said quietly, if you're ready. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure what else her heart could handle. Richard moved to the back wall, to a section of wood paneling between two patent displays. He pressed on it in a specific spot, and Margaret heard a soft click. The panel swung inward, revealing a hidden door. Behind it was a small room, no more than 10 feet square. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, each one labeled with years and categories. Patents and licensing, 1969 to 1973. Research notes and experimental data. Correspondence and personal papers. And in the center of the room, set into the floor, was a vault. It was serious equipment, the kind of safe you'd find in a bank, with a combination lock and heavy steel construction. On top of the vault sat a wooden box and another envelope. Edward's instructions were very specific, Richard said. The combination to the vault is in that envelope. It was to be opened only by Eleanor or her legal heir in my presence as executor of the estate. Margaret picked up the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single card with a string of numbers written in Edward's careful handwriting. 6, 23, 71, 38, 52, 9. She looked at Richard, who gestured toward the vault. It's yours to open. Margaret knelt beside the vault, Frank crouching beside her, his hand on her back for support. She dialed the combination carefully, each number clicking into place with solid precision. When she turned the final number, she heard the lock disengage. She gripped the handle and pulled. The vault door swung open with surprising ease, counterweighted and perfectly maintained. Inside, the vault was illuminated by automatic lights that flickered on, revealing stacks of documents, safety deposit boxes, and a large leather-bound journal. Margaret reached for the journal first. It was heavy, filled with hundreds of pages of Edward's handwriting. She opened it to a random page and read. November 8th, 1993. Tried to call Eleanor again today, got the library, asked to speak with her. She came to the phone but hung up when she heard my voice. 20 years, and the wound is still that fresh. I don't blame her. I betrayed everything we believed in. Money seems like a poor substitute for integrity. Margaret flipped to another entry. June 15th, 2001. My doctor says I have maybe 3 years. Cancer, pancreatic, inoperable. I've been thinking about legacy, about what I'll leave behind. Buildings with my name on them, scholarships, research grants. None of it matters. The only legacy that matters is the one I destroyed when I chose profit over principle. Eleanor was right. She was always right. Frank read over her shoulder, his breath warm on her neck. He never stopped thinking about her. Margaret set the journal aside gently and reached for one of the safety deposit boxes. It was metal, heavy, secured with a small key that lay beside it. She unlocked it and opened the lid. Inside were stock certificates, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, neatly organized in protective sleeves. She pulled one out carefully. Whitmore Technologies Incorporated, 1,000 shares, issued to Eleanor Rose Morrison, 1974. He put her name on everything, Richard explained. After Eleanor left, Edward founded Whitmore Technologies to manage and license the patents. He issued stock in both their names, equal shares. She never claimed it, never responded to the annual statements we sent. "How much is it worth?" Frank asked. Richard pulled out his own folder, flipping to a specific page. As of last quarter, Whitmore Technologies is valued at $1.3 billion. The shares in that box represent 50% ownership, approximately $650 million. Margaret nearly dropped the box. Frank caught it, his own hands shaking. $650 million in stock. That's in addition to the trust fund, the property, and other assets, Richard clarified. The $265 million I mentioned earlier is just the liquid trust. The total estate value, including stock holdings, real estate, intellectual property rights, and investment portfolios, is closer to $900 million. The room spun. Margaret sat down hard on the floor, breathing slowly, trying to process numbers that didn't seem real. $900 million. Her mother, who'd worked at the library for minimum wage until she was 87. Her mother, who'd clipped coupons and made her own clothes and never, ever complained about money. Her mother could have been a billionaire. She walked away from all of this, Margaret said, her voice hollow. She knew it existed, and she walked away. Not exactly, Richard said carefully. She walked away before most of it existed. In 1973, when she left, the patents were promising but not yet profitable. Edward built the fortune over the following decades, but he never removed her name, never claimed sole ownership. Every success, every innovation, every dollar earned, he attributed half to her. Margaret looked at the vault, at the stacks of documents and certificates and evidence of a partnership that had survived betrayal, distance, even death. Why? Why go to all this trouble if she refused to accept it? Richard smiled sadly. Because Edward Whitmore understood that some debts can't be paid, only honored. He couldn't give Eleanor back her principles. He couldn't undo the choice he made. But he could ensure that if she ever changed her mind, if her family ever needed it, the fortune built on their shared work would be waiting. Frank helped Margaret to her feet. She was pale, shaking, overwhelmed. "I can't. This is too much. I can't accept this." "You sound like your mother," Richard observed gently. She said almost exactly those words, according to Edward's journals. When he first tried to give her a share of the early profits, she refused, said she couldn't accept money earned from work she'd opposed. "She was right," Margaret said fiercely. "If the technology was used for weapons, for surveillance, she was right to refuse it." "Perhaps," Richard agreed, "but the technology itself was neutral. It's been used for weapons, yes, but also for medicine, education, communication. The algorithms you two developed helped create the internet, enabled global connection, brought information to billions of people. It's done tremendous good as well as harm." He moved closer to Margaret, his voice gentle but firm. "Your mother made her choice based on her principles, and that choice shaped who she was. But you're not her, Mrs. Carter. You have different circumstances, different needs, different opportunities. The question isn't whether Eleanor would accept this inheritance. The question is whether you will." Margaret looked at Frank, searching his weathered face for guidance. He'd been her partner for 51 years, seen her through raising children, burying parents, surviving every crisis life had thrown at them. His eyes were kind but uncertain. "What do you think?" she asked him. "I think," he said slowly, "that we came up this mountain today worried about paying for my heart medication. And now we're standing in a vault containing $900 million. I think I don't know what to think." Despite everything, Margaret almost laughed. Trust Frank to cut through the complexity to the simple truth. She turned back to the vault, looking at all the carefully organized evidence of Edward Whitmore's guilt and Eleanor Morrison's integrity. Two people who'd changed the world together, then spent the rest of their lives apart, separated by principles and pride. "If we accept this," she said quietly, "it changes everything." "Yes," Richard agreed, "it does. Our children, our grandchildren, our whole life. Yes, people will treat us differently, friends, family, strangers. Almost certainly." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into the vault and pulled out the leather journal again. She flipped to the final entry, dated January 15th, 2004. "This is my last entry," Edward had written. "The doctors say days, maybe a week. I'm not afraid of death, but I regret dying without reconciliation. Eleanor, if you ever read this, please know that you were the best part of my life. Our partnership, our friendship, the work we did together, those were my finest years. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to honor that. I'm sorry I chose money over meaning. But I'm grateful, eternally grateful, that you showed me there was another way. I just wish I'd been brave enough to take it. The house is yours. The fortune is yours. But more than that, the legacy of what we could have been, that's yours too. I hope your family finds peace here. I hope they understand that failure isn't in falling short of principles. Failure is in having no principles to fall short of. You taught me that, Eleanor. Thank you. Edward." Margaret closed the journal, her decision crystallizing. She looked at Richard with clear eyes. "I want to accept the inheritance," she said firmly. "All of it, but not for myself." Richard raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "My mother walked away because the technology was being used for harm. But you said it's also done good. Medicine, education, connection. What if that's the answer? What if we use this fortune to make sure the good outweighs the harm?" Frank's eyes widened with understanding. "A foundation." "Yes," Margaret said, the idea taking shape as she spoke. "The Eleanor and Edward Foundation, dedicated to ethical technology, to education, to using innovation for humanity instead of destruction. We'd be finishing what they started, honoring both of their visions." Richard's face broke into a genuine smile, the first Margaret had seen from him. "That's Mrs. Carter, that's perfect. Edward would have loved that, and I think Eleanor, if she'd known, might have accepted it on those terms." "How much would we need to keep?" Frank asked practically. "For ourselves, for our kids?" Margaret thought about the medical bills, the mortgage, the prescriptions they'd been skipping. Enough to not be afraid anymore, enough to help David and Susan with their families, enough to live comfortably. "But Frank, we don't need $900 million. Nobody needs $900 million. The trust structure could support that," Richard said, already shifting into attorney mode. "We'd establish a charitable foundation with the bulk of the assets. You'd maintain enough to ensure security for your family across multiple generations, but the primary purpose would be philanthropic. Grants for education, research into ethical AI and technology, support for innovators who prioritize social good over profit." "And the house?" Margaret asked, looking around the study. "What happens to this place?" "That's entirely up to you. It's your property." Margaret walked to the window, looking out at the mountains bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. She imagined her mother standing in this exact spot 50 years ago, young and brilliant and uncompromising. She imagined Edward here too, watching Eleanor work, knowing he was in the presence of someone truly special. We keep it, she decided. Restore it, maintain it, but also open it. Make it the foundation headquarters. Let students come here, researchers, people working on technology that serves humanity. Let them walk these halls and see what two people created when they believed innovation could be ethical. Let this house inspire the next generation, the way Edward and my mother inspired their own. She turned back to Richard, Frank and Tom, who'd been listening silently from the doorway. This place was built as a sanctuary for ideas. Let's make it that again. Richard nodded slowly, respect clear in his expression. I'll begin drawing up the paperwork immediately. This will take time to execute properly, months probably. Legal structures, tax implications, foundation bylaws. But Mrs. Carter, I think you've found the perfect solution. Tom cleared his throat. If I may say something. Everyone turned to him. The old caretaker stepped into the room, his weathered face thoughtful. I've been watching over this place for 26 years, he said, never knowing if anyone would come, if it mattered, if Mr. Whitmore's faith was justified. Seeing you here, seeing you understand what this place meant, what it could mean again, that's an answer to a question I've been carrying a long time. His voice roughened. He was a good man, Mr. Whitmore, haunted, guilty, but good. He wanted to make things right. And ma'am, I think you just did. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different. Not grief or shock, but something closer to purpose. She crossed the room and took Tom's weathered hands in her own. Thank you, she said simply, for keeping their dream alive. They stood in the hidden room for a while longer, making plans, discussing logistics, beginning to understand the magnitude of what lay ahead. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Shadows lengthened across the valley. Finally, Richard checked his watch. It's getting late. You've had an extraordinary day. Perhaps we should head back down the mountain, let you process everything. We can meet again in a few days to begin the formal proceedings. Margaret nodded, suddenly exhausted. The emotional weight of the day crashed over her like a wave. She picked up the wooden box from the top of the vault, the one she hadn't yet opened. What's this? I don't know, Richard admitted. Edward's instructions just said it was for Eleanor's family. Margaret opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in velvet, were two items. The first was a photograph in a silver frame. It showed Eleanor and Edward sitting on the deck outside, both smiling at the camera, both holding coffee mugs, morning light golden on their faces. They looked happy, content, like two people who'd found exactly where they belonged. The second item was a small velvet pouch. Margaret opened it and gasped. Inside was a simple silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a key. There was a note tucked beneath it in Edward's handwriting. Eleanor designed this. She said we were unlocking the future together. I had it made for her 49th birthday, but never got the chance to give it to her. If she never reads this, if her family finds it instead, I hope they understand what it represents. Partnership, possibility, the courage to choose principle over profit. May whoever wears this carry forward that legacy. Edward. Margaret lifted the necklace from the box, the silver catching the last rays of sunlight streaming through the window. The key pendant was beautifully crafted, delicate but strong, symbolic of everything her mother and Edward had shared. Frank, she whispered. He understood without her having to ask. He took the necklace and fastened it around her neck. The pendant settled just below her collarbone, warm against her skin. It's perfect, Frank said softly. They locked the vault, closed the hidden room, and walked back through the study into the main house. Everything looked different now that Margaret understood what it represented. Not just wealth, but dedication. Not just property, but principle. Not just inheritance, but responsibility. At the front door, she paused and looked back one more time. The house seemed to glow in the twilight, windows reflecting the last light of day. Somewhere in these rooms, her mother had lived a life Margaret never knew about. Somewhere in these walls, two brilliant minds had worked together to change the world. And now, impossibly, it all belonged to her. Not to keep, not to hide, but to share, to honor, to transform into something that would make both Eleanor and Edward proud. They drove down the mountain in silence, following Richard's sedan, Tom's truck bringing up the rear. The forest grew dark around them, stars beginning to prick the deepening blue above. When they finally reached the gate, Tom got out to unlock it, and Margaret rolled down her window. "Tom?" she called. He walked over. "Yes, ma'am?" "You're not just a caretaker anymore. If you're willing, I'd like you to be part of this foundation. You knew Edward. You've protected this place. We need someone who understands what it means." Tom's eyes widened. "Ma'am, I'm just a maintenance man." "You're the person Edward trusted with his most precious legacy," Margaret corrected. "That makes you family." He nodded slowly, too moved to speak. He unlocked the gate, and they drove through. As they descended from the mountains back toward their regular lives, Frank reached over and took Margaret's hand. "You okay?" he asked. She touched the key pendant at her throat, feeling its weight, its promise. "I don't know. Ask me again in a year." He smiled. "We went up that mountain this morning worried about bills. And we're coming down billionaires, responsible for $900 million and a legacy that could change thousands of lives." "No pressure," Margaret said, and despite everything, they both laughed. The laughter felt good, felt necessary, felt like the first breath after being underwater too long. They'd climbed the mountain as desperate retirees and descended as guardians of something far greater than themselves. Ahead, the lights of civilization began to glow in the valley. Behind them, the mountain house waited in darkness, patient and preserved, ready for whatever came next. Margaret didn't know what the future held, didn't know how to be wealthy, how to run a foundation, how to honor a mother she'd thought she'd known completely but had barely understood at all. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't going to waste this second chance. Not hers, not her mother's, not Edward's. Too many people had suffered from choices made in fear or greed. It was time for choices made from hope and principle. The key pendant swayed gently against her chest with each turn in the road, catching light from the dashboard, reminding her that some doors, once unlocked, changed everything that came after. And Margaret Carter, 72 years old, grease-stained hands and weathered heart, was ready to step through. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed beside Frank in their small ranch house, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning through everything that had happened. The mountain house, the vault, the $900 million, her mother's secret life. Edward Whitmore's decades of guilt. The key pendant rested on her nightstand, silver gleaming in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. She kept reaching over to touch it, making sure it was real, that the entire day hadn't been some elaborate dream born from financial desperation and grief. Beside her, Frank's breathing was steady but not deep. He wasn't sleeping either. "You awake?" she whispered. "Haven't slept a minute," he admitted. "Keep doing math in my head. 900 million divided by our mortgage payment equals, well, more months than I can calculate." "Frank." I know. It's not about us keeping it all. But Maggie, we could pay off the house tomorrow, pay off David and Susan's houses, set up college funds for all the grandkids, never worry about medical bills again. We could do all that with just a fraction of it." "I know." He rolled toward her, his face barely visible in the darkness. "But what if we're wrong? What if trying to run some big foundation is too much for us? We're 72 and 75 years old. We don't know anything about managing that kind of money." Margaret touched the pendant again, feeling its weight. "Mama managed to walk away from all of it. Surely we can manage to give most of it away." They were quiet for a moment. Then Frank said, "We should call the kids in the morning. They deserve to know. They'll think we've lost our minds." "Probably," Frank agreed. "But they should hear it from us before Richard's paperwork starts landing and word gets out." Margaret reached for his hand in the darkness. "Everything's going to change, isn't it?" "It already has." The next morning, they called David first. He answered on the third ring, his voice harried. "Hey, Mum, can I call you back? I'm heading into a meeting." "David, we need to talk. It's important." Something in her tone made him pause. "Is Dad okay? Are you okay?" "We're fine. Better than fine. But something happened yesterday and you need to know about it." She heard him step away from office noise, a door closing. "You're scaring me. What happened?" Margaret took a breath. "Remember I told you about finding that property deed in Grandma Eleanor's things? The mountain house thing you insisted on driving up to see, yeah. We found it. And David, it's real, all of it. The property, the inheritance, everything." She heard him sigh. "Mum, I know you wanted this to be something, but—" "David, be quiet and listen. Your grandmother co-owned a 17-acre estate with a man named Edward Whitmore. He was a tech innovator, held patents that became fundamental to computer technology. When Grandma walked away from their partnership in 1973, he kept her name on everything. He died in 2004 and left it all in trust, waiting for her or her family. Mum, the estate is worth $900 million. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. David? That's not funny. I'm not joking. We met with the estate attorney yesterday, saw the property, the documents, the vault with stock certificates and trust funds. It's all real, and legally, it's mine. It's ours. More silence, then quietly, $900 million. Yes. Jesus Christ. We're setting up a foundation, Margaret continued. Most of the money will go to charitable work, education, ethical technology research. We're keeping enough to secure the family, pay off debts, help you and your sister. But David, the bulk of it is going to honor what your grandmother and Edward tried to build. She heard something that might have been a laugh or a sob. I need to sit down. Are you sitting? Now I am. Mom, I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. Does Susan know? You're the first call. We're calling her next. She's going to lose her mind. Probably. They talked for another 20 minutes, David asking questions Margaret couldn't fully answer yet, offering to connect them with financial advisors he knew, suggesting lawyers and accountants. By the end, his voice had shifted from shock to something like protectiveness. Mum, you need to be careful. When word gets out that you inherited this kind of money, people are going to come out of the woodwork. Distant relatives, scammers, everyone with a sob story or a business opportunity. I know, honey. And you can't tell anyone outside the immediate family yet. Not friends, not neighbors, nobody until all the legal stuff is locked down tight. Richard said the same thing. Richard's the attorney? Yes, he's been managing the estate since 2001. Took over from his father who handled it from the beginning. He seems trustworthy. I'll have my friend Jason check him out, just to be safe. Margaret smiled despite herself, her son trying to protect her. That's fine, David. Whatever makes you feel better. Susan's reaction was different. Margaret's daughter lived in Oregon with her husband, teaching high school English, raising 3 boys. When Margaret told her the news, Susan went completely silent for so long Margaret thought the call had dropped. Susan, I'm here. Her voice was strange, tight. I'm just Mom, this doesn't make sense. Grandma lived like she was poor her whole life. She wasn't poor. She was principled. What's the difference? She walked away from the money because of how it was earned. She could have been rich, but chose not to be. That's insane. Margaret felt a flash of defensive anger. It's integrity. It's pride, Mom. Stupid, stubborn pride. Do you know what our childhood could have been like if she'd just accepted even a fraction of this money? The opportunities we could have had. We had good childhoods. We had hand-me-downs and food stamps and you working 2 jobs while Dad delivered mail 60 hours a week. We had you stressed and exhausted all the time. And apparently it was all unnecessary because Grandma was secretly a tech billionaire? Susan, no, I'm sorry, but this is messed up. She let you struggle when she could have helped. She let you go without when she was sitting on a fortune. How is that principled? How is that anything but selfish? Margaret gripped the phone tighter. Your grandmother made choices based on her values. Maybe you don't agree with them, but they were hers to make. And now you're going to make the same choice? Give it all away to some foundation while we're still struggling with student loans and mortgage payments? We're taking care of the family, Susan. You, David, the grandkids. Nobody's going to struggle anymore. But we're not keeping it. We're keeping enough. Susan laughed, bitter and sharp. Enough by whose definition? Mom, you could live like queens. You could travel the world, buy whatever you want, never worry about anything again. Instead, you're going to play philanthropist with money you didn't even earn. Your grandmother earned it. Apparently, she didn't think so. The conversation deteriorated from there. They hung up with tension crackling between them, Susan upset and Margaret hurt. Frank held her while she cried, frustrated tears born from the realization that money, even money intended for good, could still divide people. Over the following days, more complications emerged. Richard called with updates on the legal process, warning them about tax implications and estate complexities that would take months to untangle. A reporter from Denver somehow caught wind of the story and showed up at their house, forcing them to disconnect the doorbell and draw the curtains. Distant relatives Margaret barely remembered started calling, suddenly interested in reconnecting. A second cousin she hadn't spoken to in 30 years wanted to discuss family matters. Her mother's elderly neighbor called to remind Margaret that Eleanor had once promised her some dishes. Couldn't that promise perhaps extend to other household items now that the estate was so substantial? Frank's brother showed up unannounced, a man they'd seen twice in the last decade, suddenly warm and familiar, mentioning casually that he'd always dreamed of starting a business if only he had the capital. Margaret stopped answering the phone, stopped checking social media where rumors were spreading like wildfire, stopped trying to explain to people that this wasn't a lottery win or unexpected windfall, but a complicated inheritance wrapped in decades of guilt and principle and pain. She found herself back at the mountain house 3 days later, needing space from the chaos below. Tom let her in, and she walked through the rooms alone, trying to feel her mother's presence, trying to understand the choices Eleanor had made. In the library, she pulled down the Emily Dickinson collection again, the one with the pressed flower and her mother's handwriting in the margins. She sat in the reading chair by the window and opened to the marked page. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. Had her mother felt hopeful when she walked away? Or had she felt broken, defeated, like she'd failed somehow by not being able to convince Edward to share her principles? Margaret flipped through the book, finding more underlined passages, more margin notes. Then, tucked near the back, she found a folded piece of paper. Library stationery, dated March 1973. It was a letter, unfinished, in her mother's handwriting. Dear Edward, I've tried a dozen times to write this, to explain why I can't stay, why I can't be part of what you're building anymore. It's not anger, though God knows I'm angry. It's not judgment, though I do judge this choice. It's heartbreak. We created something beautiful together, something that could have changed the world for the better. And you're selling it to people who will use it to hurt others, to control them, to destroy. You say I'm being naive, that technology is neutral, that we can't control how it's used once it's out there. But that's exactly why we should control who we give it to. We have a responsibility, Edward, not just to innovate, but to protect. And if you won't share that responsibility, then I can't share this work. I hope someday you'll understand. I hope someday. The letter ended there, unfinished. Margaret imagined her mother sitting in this very chair, trying to find words adequate to the pain of walking away from someone she'd trusted, someone she'd built dreams with. She understood now why Eleanor had never told her about this place, about Edward, about any of it. The wound had been too deep, the loss too great. Better to pretend it had never happened than to live with constant reminder of what could have been. But Margaret wasn't her mother. She'd lived a different life, faced different choices, and sitting in this house surrounded by the evidence of innovation and integrity, she realized something crucial. Her mother had walked away to preserve her principles. That was Eleanor's victory. But Margaret's victory could be different. She could take what Edward and Eleanor had built, what they'd learned from their mistakes, and transform it into something that honored both of their visions. She pulled out her phone and called Richard. "I've made my decision," she said when he answered. "I want to accept everything, the estate, the stocks, all of it, and I want to establish the foundation exactly as we discussed. But Richard, I need you to understand something. This isn't charity. This is completion. This is finishing work that was started 52 years ago and never got to reach its full potential." "I understand," Richard said quietly. "And Mrs. Carter, for what it's worth, I think both Edward and your mother would be proud." "I hope so," Margaret said, looking around the library at the books and photographs and evidence of two brilliant minds that had almost changed the world. "I really hope so." She stayed at the house until sunset, walking the rooms, memorizing details, saying goodbye to the version of this place that had existed in suspension for so long. When she locked the door and drove down the mountain, she felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but more resolved. The complications wouldn't disappear. Susan's anger, the reporters, the distant relatives, the overwhelming responsibility of managing a fortune, all of that would still be waiting. But Margaret had found clarity in the place where her mother had lost hers. This inheritance wasn't a burden or a windfall. It was an opportunity to finish something important, to prove that principle and pragmatism didn't have to be enemies, to show that money could be a tool for good if wielded with intention and integrity. Her mother had walked away from $900 million to preserve her soul. Margaret would accept it to honor that very same soul. Different choices, same values, and maybe finally a chance for redemption that spanned 2 generations and 50 years of separation. The key pendant swayed against her chest as she drove, catching the last light of day. Unlocking the future, Edward had said. Margaret was ready to see what door it opened next. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the great room of the Mountain House, no longer silent and suspended in time, but alive with purpose. The space had been transformed carefully, respectfully. The vintage furniture remained, but now comfortable chairs circled discussion areas. The walls still held the original photographs of Eleanor and Edward, but new frames had been added showcasing the Foundation's mission statement, written by Margaret herself in her mother's precise handwriting style. The Eleanor and Edward Foundation exists to ensure that innovation serves humanity, that technology honors ethics, and that the future we build together reflects the principles we hold sacred. We believe that brilliance without conscience is dangerous, that profit without purpose is empty, and that the greatest legacy we can leave is a world slightly better than the one we inherited. Workstations had been set up in what used to be the formal dining room, computers humming softly, researchers bent over keyboards. In the library, graduate students pored over the original patents and documents, studying not just the technology but the ethical frameworks Eleanor had tried to establish. The laboratory downstairs, untouched for 52 years, had been restored and modernized, now hosting visiting scholars working on projects the Foundation funded. Margaret walked through it all with Tom at her side, both of them marveling at how quickly the house had come back to life. "Mr. Whitmore would be amazed," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is what he always hoped for, people using this place to create something good." And Mama, Margaret added softly. She'd be proud too, I think. We're doing it her way this time. The legal work had been exhausting. Richard and his team had spent months establishing the foundation structure, navigating tax codes, setting up the trust frameworks. Margaret and Frank had kept $5 million for themselves, enough to eliminate all debt, secure their retirement, help their children substantially, and establish college funds for every grandchild. It seemed like an unfathomable amount until Margaret realized it represented less than 1% of the total estate. The rest, $895 million, went into the foundation. Richard had assembled a board of directors, experts in technology ethics, education, and philanthropy. But Margaret insisted on one condition. She would serve as board chair, at least for the first 5 years. This was her mother's legacy, and she needed to ensure it started correctly. David had come around eventually, especially after his student loans disappeared, and Margaret helped him put a down payment on a bigger house for his growing family. He'd even joined the foundation board, bringing his business expertise to bear on grant decisions and operational efficiency. Susan had been harder. She'd accepted the money Margaret offered, paid off her mortgage, started college funds for her boys. But the relationship remained strained. Susan couldn't understand why her mother was giving away a fortune, and Margaret couldn't make her daughter see that some inheritances came with responsibilities larger than personal comfort. Maybe someday she'll understand, Frank had said one night as they lay in their new bedroom, in the modest but comfortable house they'd bought in town, close to the mountain but not isolated. Or maybe she won't. You can't control how people react to your choices, Maggie. I know, Margaret had replied. Mama taught me that, whether she meant to or not. Now, 6 months into the foundation's operation, Margaret was beginning to see the impact. They'd awarded their first round of grants, $2 million distributed to 12 projects, a team developing affordable medical diagnostic technology for rural areas, a researcher working on water purification systems that didn't require electricity, a group of high school students in Detroit building computer literacy programs for seniors, a professor studying ways to eliminate bias in artificial intelligence algorithms. Each grant recipient had to demonstrate not just technical innovation, but ethical consideration. What were the potential harms of their work? Who might be negatively affected? How would they ensure equitable access? The foundation didn't just fund technology, it funded thoughtful technology. Media attention had been intense initially. Every news outlet wanted the story of the elderly couple who'd inherited a fortune and given it away. But Richard had helped Margaret craft careful statements, and gradually the frenzy died down. Now the foundation was judged not by its origin story, but by its work, which was exactly how Margaret wanted it. She was reviewing grant applications in the study, Edward's old study, where she'd first read his letter of apology, when Richard called. Margaret, I've found something you need to see. What is it? I've been going through some of Edward's archived correspondence, documents that were in storage. I found letters between Edward and some of his former colleagues, people who worked with him and your mother back in the 70s. Margaret sat up straighter. Are any of them still alive? 3 that I've been able to locate. One is a woman named Judith Chen. She worked with Edward and Eleanor on some of the early algorithm development. She's 89 now, living in Boulder. She didn't know Eleanor had passed. Margaret, she's been asking about her for decades. Margaret's heart clenched. She knew my mother? She was apparently quite close to both of them. According to the letters, she sided with Eleanor when the split happened, stopped working with Edward in solidarity. I think she'd very much like to meet you. 2 days later, Margaret and Frank drove to Boulder. Judith Chen lived in a tidy assisted living facility with mountain views and well-tended gardens. She met them in the common room, a tiny woman with white hair pulled back in a bun, sharp eyes behind thick glasses, and a smile that transformed her whole face when she saw Margaret. "You look just like her," Judith said, gripping Margaret's hands with surprising strength. "Eleanor at your age, the same eyes, the same serious expression." They sat together, and Judith pulled out her own collection of photographs. Eleanor and Judith working side by side at a computer terminal. The three of them, Eleanor, Edward, and Judith, celebrating some breakthrough, champagne glasses raised. Eleanor alone, laughing at something off-camera, joy radiating from her face. "Your mother was the smartest person I ever met," Judith said. "And I've known Nobel Prize winners, darling, but Eleanor had something beyond intelligence. She had wisdom. She understood that knowledge without ethics was dangerous, that we had responsibilities beyond our own ambitions." "She never told me any of this," Margaret said quietly. "I didn't know she'd done this work until 6 months ago." Judith nodded knowingly. She buried it. After she left Edward, she tried to bury that whole part of her life. It hurt too much, I think. They'd been such perfect partners, such matched minds. Walking away from him meant walking away from the work too, from the possibilities. I think she couldn't bear to remember what might have been. "Did she ever talk about it, after she left?" "Once," Judith said. "I went to visit her maybe a year after the split. She was working at the library by then, living that quiet life. I asked if she regretted it, walking away from everything. You know what she said?" Margaret shook her head, throat tight. She said, "I regret that it came to a choice, but I'll never regret the choice I made." That was Eleanor, absolute in her convictions. Judith reached over and took Margaret's hand again. "What you're doing with the foundation, honoring both of their visions, finding a way to make the technology serve the ethics instead of abandoning one for the other, that's what they should have done from the beginning. You're healing a 50-year-old wound, Margaret. That's remarkable." They talked for hours. Judith shared stories of the early days, the excitement of pioneering work, the late nights solving impossible problems, the sense that they were building something genuinely new. She talked about Edward's brilliance but also his blindness, how success had intoxicated him, made him willing to compromise principles for progress. And she talked about Eleanor's stubborn integrity, her refusal to bend even when bending might have let her keep some influence over how the technology was used. They were both right and both wrong, Judith concluded. Edward was right that the technology itself was neutral, that it would develop with or without them. But Eleanor was right that they had a responsibility to try to guide it toward good. If they'd found a middle path, if they'd compromised with each other instead of walking away, imagine what they could have accomplished. "That's what I'm trying to do now," Margaret said. "Find that middle path." Judith smiled. "I'd like to help if you'll let me. I may be 89, but my mind still works. I could consult on grant applications, help evaluate the ethical implications of proposed projects. I've spent 50 years thinking about this stuff." "I'd be honored," Margaret said warmly. They left Boulder with Judith's promise to visit the mountain house the following week. In the car, Margaret was quiet, processing everything she'd learned. "You okay?" Frank asked. "I spent my whole life thinking I knew my mother completely. Now I'm meeting people who knew sides of her I never saw. It's like discovering she was a whole different person before I was born." "Everyone is," Frank pointed out gently. "Your kids probably can't imagine us as young people, falling in love, building a life before they existed. We all contain multitudes, Maggie." She smiled at the reference. Her mother had loved Walt Whitman too. "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." "Exactly," Frank said. "Your mother contained both the librarian who raised you and the innovator who changed technology. Both were real. Both were her." Over the following months, more pieces fell into place. Judith introduced them to the other surviving colleagues, 2 men in their 80s who'd worked on different aspects of the early projects. Each had stories to share, memories of Eleanor that filled out the picture of who she'd been. One remembered her arguing passionately in meetings, refusing to let ethical considerations be dismissed as impractical. Another recalled her mentoring younger researchers, especially women, encouraging them to speak up and claim space in the male-dominated field. A third mentioned her habit of taking long walks when stuck on a problem, returning with solutions that seemed to come from nowhere but were really the product of deep, sustained thinking. Margaret collected these stories like precious artifacts, storing them alongside the photographs and documents, building a fuller understanding of her mother's life. And slowly, painfully, she began to forgive Eleanor for the secrets, for the silence, for choosing principle over comfort, because Margaret understood now what it had cost her mother to walk away. Not just money, though that was real, but community, purpose, the work she loved, partnerships that had defined her. Eleanor had given up everything that made her feel vital and alive because she couldn't compromise her ethics. That wasn't stubbornness or pride. That was courage of the highest order. The Foundation's first annual gathering took place on a crisp October day, almost exactly 1 year after Margaret and Frank had first driven up the mountain searching for answers to a mystery they didn't yet understand. The great room of the mountain house filled with people, grant recipients sharing their progress, board members discussing strategy, researchers excitedly comparing notes. Judith was there, sharp as ever despite needing a walker now. Tom had brought his wife, both of them proud of what the property had become. David came with his family, his teenagers wide-eyed at the mountain estate. Even Susan came, though she stayed at the periphery still processing her complicated feelings. Margaret stood at the front of the room as conversations died down, Frank beside her, his hand warm in hers. She looked out at the assembled faces, at the energy and hope and purpose filling this space that had sat empty for so long. "A year ago," she began, her voice steady, "I climbed into my husband's old truck, worried about medical bills and mortgage payments. I had no idea that a piece of paper in my mother's attic would lead me here, to this house, to this inheritance, to all of you." She paused, gathering her thoughts. My mother, Eleanor Morrison, and Edward Whitmore built something extraordinary together. They pioneered technology that changed the world. But they also learned a hard lesson about the cost of progress without principle. When faced with a choice between profit and ethics, they chose differently, and it broke their partnership. Margaret touched the key pendant at her throat, a gesture that had become habit. Edward spent the rest of his life trying to make amends. My mother spent hers trying to forget. Both of them carried regret and pain until their deaths. And that tragedy, that unfinished story, that's what we're here to complete. She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. This foundation exists because two brilliant people got it both right and wrong. Edward was right that technology will advance regardless of individual choices. My mother was right that we have a responsibility to guide that advancement toward good. What we're doing here is proving that those two truths don't have to be in conflict. There was movement at the back of the room, and Margaret saw Susan slip out quietly. Her heart ached, but she continued. In this past year, we've funded 12 projects. Some will succeed, some will fail. That's the nature of innovation. But every single one is being pursued with ethical consideration at its core. Every researcher we support has thought deeply about implications, about who benefits and who might be harmed, about responsibility and access and equity. That's the legacy my mother fought for. That's the redemption Edward sought. And that's what we're building together. She smiled, feeling tears prick her eyes. So thank you. Thank you for being part of this. Thank you for believing that technology can serve humanity instead of dominating it. And thank you for helping me understand that the best way to honor the past is to learn from it, not to repeat it. The room erupted in applause. Margaret stepped back, overwhelmed, and Frank pulled her close. Over his shoulder, she saw the photograph on the wall, young Eleanor and Edward grinning beside their first prototype, before ambition and principle had torn them apart. They looked so hopeful, so certain they could change the world. They had changed it, Margaret thought, just not in the way they'd planned. Later, as the sun set and people began to leave, Margaret found herself alone on the deck where that photograph had been taken. The valley spread below her, mountains rolling away to the horizon, the same view her mother had seen 52 years ago. She heard footsteps and turned to find Susan approaching hesitantly. "I'm sorry I left," Susan said quietly. "Your speech was beautiful. I just couldn't. I needed air." Margaret gestured to the railing, and they stood side by side, mother and daughter, looking at the fading light. "I'm trying to understand," Susan continued. "I really am. But, Mum, when I see what you're giving away, what Grandma walked away from, it makes me angry. Not at you exactly, but at the waste of it. All that struggle, all those years of barely making it, and it didn't have to be that way." "No," Margaret agreed. "It didn't. Your grandmother could have compromised, taken some of the money, used it to make our lives easier. And maybe she was wrong not to. Maybe her principles were too absolute, too unforgiving." She turned to look at her daughter. "But Susan, those principles also made her who she was. The woman who taught you to stand up for what you believe. The grandmother who refused to lie, even white lies, because integrity mattered more than convenience. That came from the same place as her choice to walk away from the money." "I know," Susan said, her voice breaking. "I just wish she'd found a way to have both, integrity and security." "Me too, baby. Me too." Margaret pulled her daughter into a hug. "But she didn't, and now we have the chance to do it differently, to prove that you can honor principles and still live in the world. That's what this foundation is about. It's not choosing between Eleanor's ethics and Edward's pragmatism. It's finding a way to embrace both." They held each other as the stars began to emerge, the mountain air cooling around them. Below, in the great room, conversations continued, connections forming, ideas sparking. The house was fulfilling its purpose at last. "I'm proud of you, Mum," Susan finally whispered. "Even if I don't completely understand it, I'm proud." "That's enough," Margaret said. "That's more than enough." The next morning, Margaret woke early in one of the upstairs bedrooms where she and Frank had stayed the night. The house was quiet, most guests having left the evening before. She dressed and walked downstairs, finding Tom already in the kitchen making coffee. "Morning, Mrs. Carter." "Morning, Tom. And please, it's Margaret." He smiled and poured her a cup. They sat together at the kitchen island, comfortable in the kind of silence that only comes from genuine friendship. "Can I show you something?" Tom asked after a while. "Of course." He led her down to the laboratory level, a space Margaret still hadn't spent much time in. It had been modernized for the Foundation's visiting researchers, but Tom guided her past the new equipment to a corner that remained original. There, mounted on the wall, was a whiteboard covered in faded equations and diagrams. The markers had long since dried, but the ghostly writing was still visible. "Mr. Whitmore told me never to erase this," Tom said. "Said it was the last problem he and Eleanor worked on together. Never got to finish it. He kept it up as a reminder of what they'd lost." Margaret stepped closer, studying the complex mathematics she didn't fully understand. But at the bottom, she could make out two sets of handwriting: Edward's bold, slashing script, and her mother's precise, careful letters. "They were trying to solve something about error correction," Tom explained, "making sure data transmitted accurately over long distances. Mr. Whitmore said Eleanor had an insight the night before she left, but they never got to test it. Always wondered if it would have worked." Margaret touched the board gently. "What happened to the problem? Did anyone solve it?" "Actually, yeah. About 10 years later, a team at MIT cracked it. Their solution is now standard in telecommunications. But Mr. Whitmore always said if Eleanor had stayed, they'd have gotten there first." They stood in silence, honoring the unfinished work, The partnership cut short, the possibilities lost. "Tom," Margaret said slowly, "what if we found someone to finish it?" "Ma'am?" "Not solve the problem, that's done, but finish their work, take their approach, their ethical framework, and apply it to current challenges. Make this room active again. Let researchers work here using Eleanor and Edward's principles as a foundation, literally building on what they started." Tom's eyes widened. "That would be, Mrs. Carter. That would make this place exactly what it was supposed to be." "Then let's do it." Over the following months, the vision took shape. The foundation established a residency program, bringing in pairs of researchers to work at the Mountain House for 3 to 6 month periods. They'd live on-site, use the laboratory, have access to all of Edward and Eleanor's original work. But the pairs had to include both technical expertise and ethical training. Scientist and philosopher, engineer and humanist, deliberately recreating the kind of partnership Eleanor and Edward had embodied. The first residents arrived in the spring, a computer scientist from Stanford and an ethicist from Georgetown. They stood in the laboratory, looking at that whiteboard with its faded equations, and felt the weight of legacy. "We're walking in the footsteps of giants," the scientist said. "Then we'd better not stumble," the ethicist replied. Margaret visited them regularly, bringing lunch, asking about their progress. They were working on transparency in algorithmic decision-making, trying to create systems that could explain their reasoning in ways ordinary people could understand and question. It was exactly the kind of work Eleanor would have championed. One afternoon, the ethicist pulled Margaret aside. "I've been reading your mother's papers, her notes on the original projects. She was asking questions in 1973 that we're still struggling with now, about control, about power, about who gets to decide how technology shapes society. She was so far ahead of her time." "She paid a price for it," Margaret said quietly. "The prophets always do." As the Foundation's second year began, Margaret found herself settling into the role she'd never imagined. She wasn't just administering an inheritance anymore. She was building something living and growing, something that would outlast her, something that would carry forward the best of what her mother and Edward had dreamed. The medical bills that had once terrified her were distant memories. The house in town was warm and comfortable. Frank's heart medication arrived on time every month without her having to choose between it and groceries. David's family was thriving. Susan had started speaking to her regularly again, even if she still struggled with some of Margaret's choices. But more than the material security, Margaret had found purpose. She woke up every morning with work that mattered, decisions that could ripple outward in ways she'd never dreamed possible. She wasn't just fixing her family's financial problems. She was helping to shape how technology would develop for generations to come. 1 year after the first annual gathering, they held the second. The great room was packed now, twice as many people, twice as much energy. Grant recipients shared breakthroughs and setbacks. Researchers presented findings. Board members debated priorities for the coming year. And in the back of the room, Margaret spotted a familiar face. An old woman in a wheelchair, oxygen tube in her nose, but eyes bright with interest. She made her way through the crowd. "Judith, you came?" "Wouldn't miss it, darling. Besides, I wanted to see if you'd done what I suggested." "Which suggestion was that?" Judith grinned. "Naming the laboratory." Margaret led her downstairs where a new plaque had been mounted beside the entrance. The Eleanor Morrison and Edward Whitmore Collaborative Laboratory, where innovation meets integrity. "Perfect," Judith said, her eyes misty. They'd both have hated it, which means it's exactly right. They stood together in the laboratory doorway, watching the current residents work, listening to their animated discussion about bias in machine learning algorithms, seeing the future take shape from the foundation of the past. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Judith said softly. "Not because of the money or the foundation or any of the grand gestures, but because you took a painful legacy and transformed it into hope. That's what she tried to do her whole life, turn pain into purpose." "I learned from the best," Margaret replied. That evening, as the gathering wound down, Margaret stood once more on the deck with Frank. The same view, the same mountains, the same stars, but everything else had changed. "What are you thinking?" Frank asked. "That a year ago we drove up this mountain desperate and afraid. And now we're standing here, having just hosted 100 people working to make the world better. It doesn't seem real." "It's real," Frank assured her. "Your hands built this, Maggie. Your choices, your vision, your courage." She leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of 51 years together. "We built it. I couldn't have done this without you." "Sure you could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." They stood in comfortable silence until Margaret felt a presence behind them. She turned to find Tom approaching with something in his hands. "Mrs. Carter, I found this in Mr. Whitmore's personal effects. It's taken me this long to work up the nerve to give it to you." It was a small journal, leather-bound and worn. Margaret opened it carefully. The first entry was dated March 20th, 1973, 3 days after Eleanor had walked away. "She's gone. The house feels empty, lifeless. I keep turning to ask her opinion on something and remembering she's not here. I've lost my partner, my friend, my better angel. The work we were doing, the dreams we shared, none of it means anything without her collaboration. I sold our principles for profit, and the price was everything that mattered. I don't know how to live with this. I don't know how to move forward, but I have to try. Maybe someday I'll find a way to make this right. Maybe someday she'll forgive me. Probably not. Probably I'll carry this regret until the day I die. But I'll keep building, keep working, keep hoping that somewhere, somehow, the good we tried to do together will find a way to exist in the world. Even if Eleanor and I can't be partners anymore, maybe our vision can still survive. I'll make sure it does. I owe her that much." Margaret closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Frank held her while she cried, while the weight of 50 years of separation and longing and regret washed over her. "They never stopped loving each other," she whispered. "Not romantically, but as partners, as collaborators. They never stopped missing what they'd had together." "And now you've given it back to them," Frank said. "Not the partnership itself, but its purpose. You've finished what they started." Later, alone in the study, Margaret sat at Edward's old desk and opened her laptop. She'd been working on something for weeks, a document that felt important, but she hadn't been ready to complete. Now, finally, she knew what it needed to say. "To the future leaders of the Eleanor Morrison and Edward Whitmore Foundation," she typed. "You're reading this because I'm gone, or too old to continue, or because leadership has passed to a new generation. That's as it should be. This foundation was never about me. It was about completing a story that began before I was born and will continue long after I'm forgotten. My mother and Edward Whitmore created something revolutionary together, then lost it because they couldn't find a way to balance principle and pragmatism. This foundation exists to prove that balance is possible. That innovation doesn't have to abandon ethics. That progress can be guided by conscience. You'll face challenges I can't imagine. Technology will evolve in ways that seem impossible today, but the core question will remain the same. How do we ensure that human advancement serves humanity? How do we build a future that reflects our best values, not our worst impulses? My mother taught me that some things are worth walking away from. Edward taught me that some mistakes haunt you forever. Together, they taught me that the greatest legacy isn't what we build, but how we build it, why we build it, who we build it for. Carry that forward. Honor both their visions. Be bold enough to innovate and brave enough to question. And remember that the truest measure of success isn't wealth or recognition or technological achievement. It's whether we made the world slightly better, slightly kinder, slightly more just than we found it. If you can do that, then everything my mother sacrificed, everything Edward regretted, everything this inheritance represents will have been worth it. With hope and trust, Margaret Rose Carter. She saved the document and sat back, looking around the study. In a frame on the wall was the key pendant, the one Edward had made for Eleanor but never got to give her. Margaret had worn it for a year before deciding it belonged here, in the Foundation's home, a symbol of unlocking potential. Beside it hung the final letter Eleanor had written to Edward, the unfinished one Margaret had found in the library. And next to that, Edward's letter of apology, the one that had started this whole journey. Two people who'd changed the world, broken each other's hearts, and spent the rest of their lives apart. Their story could have ended in tragedy and waste. Instead, through the accident of an attic discovery and the courage of a desperate elderly couple, it had transformed into hope. Anyone can change the world if they're willing to choose principle over profit, courage over comfort, and legacy over luxury. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property or patents worth billions. Sometimes it's the chance to finish something important that others started, to heal wounds that seemed permanent, and to prove that it's never too late to build something that matters. For Margaret and Frank Carter, what started as a 75-cent bid became a $900 million responsibility, became something far more valuable. A reminder that our choices ripple forward through time, that redemption is always possible, and that the best way to honor those we've lost is to complete the good work they began. As Margaret turned off the lights in the study and walked through the quiet house, she thought about her mother shelving books at the library, about Edward sitting alone in this mansion haunted by guilt, about two brilliant minds that had almost changed the world together. They'd failed in their time, broken by the same principles that had united them. But their failure had planted seeds. And 50 years later, in the hands of a grease-stained mechanic who'd bought a mystery property out of desperation, those seeds had finally begun to bloom. The mountain house sat dark and peaceful against the star-filled sky, no longer a tomb of lost possibilities, but a workshop for future ones. Somewhere inside, researchers dreamed of algorithms that could be trusted. Students studied the ethics of innovation. Boards and committees planned grants that would ripple outward, touching lives, shaping the future. And in a modest house in town, Margaret and Frank slept peacefully, freed from the fear that had defined their final years, empowered by purpose they'd never imagined, guardians of a legacy that had chosen them as surely as they'd chosen it. Because sometimes all it takes is one old deed in an attic, one desperate drive up a mountain, and one choice to honor the past by building a better future. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the truth deserves a voice, and that legacies are meant to be finished, not forgotten.